Chapter 8.
The Complexities of Coping. Quote, hurting myself or hurting others means they won. Life shouldn't hurt. End quote. Bobby. This chapter encourages you to explore the important area of coping, but we want to mention something at the outset. Many people who experience childhood harm have a genius for self-blame. They not only experience the pain associated with what happened to them, but they can also punish themselves for how they have coped. It's likely that reading this chapter and doing the exercises will stir up some difficult feelings because it asks you to explore patterns of coping. Here is what we think is important. As you read this chapter, we want to encourage you not to beat up on yourself for how you have coped in the past. Looking at coping from the standpoint of self-blame may boost self-loathing, but does little to enhance recovery. Of course, it's important to take responsibility for your recovery, but it's better to explore coping psychologically. In other words, if you have acted in ways which have made things worse or caused difficulties, there will be reasons for this. Punishing yourself simply is unhelpful and misses the point. And what is the point? The point of this chapter isn't to give you all the skills necessary to cope. Much of what happens through the remainder of the guidebook will focus on that area in one way or another. This chapter encourages you to develop insight into how you have coped and why you may have developed certain ways of coping. If you are doing the work in this chapter and find yourself lapsing into self-punishing thoughts, or if you start dredging up memories of times you made mistakes, we want you to notice this is happening. See if there's a way you can look at this with insight and self-compassion. What is meant by coping? If human beings are in enough pain, they are likely to do whatever is necessary to escape pain. How we go about getting away from pain is coping. However, the need to cope with pain can be a more complex and insistent issue for those who experienced childhood harm. For one thing, these individuals are likely to experience more significant psychological pain, symptoms, such as anxiety, depression, anger, intrusive memories, sleep disturbance, and so on. And this emotional pain often goes deeper than this. As we have explored, these individuals did not get important needs met in childhood. Needs for safety, affection, belonging, and self-esteem. Related to unmet needs, these individuals sometimes describe the feeling of a void or an emptiness, a sense that something is missing. Those who experienced childhood harm were set up to develop problems with coping, which is something which really needs to be appreciated. Clinicians sometimes use the terms maladaptive coping and adaptive coping. While these terms may sound overly technical, they can be helpful in the way they connect coping with human needs. If an individual copes in a way which seems to help in the short term, often by reducing or numbing pain, but means that deeper needs don't get met, we'd say that's maladaptive coping. For example, getting drunk, isolating yourself, or self-harming might reduce short-term pain quickly, but may also prevent someone from meeting needs for safety, belonging, or self-esteem. If individuals cope in a way that leads to soothing some pain and supports getting important needs met, that's adaptive coping. The distinction between adaptive and maladaptive coping might sound simple and easy, but in practice it's often not. For one thing, distinguishing adaptive from maladaptive coping is not always straightforward. Also, adaptive coping is often not as powerful and immediate as maladaptive coping, and many people who experienced childhood harm have come to depend on their particular manner of maladaptive coping. Developing insight into coping and the confidence that you can get important needs met often requires patience and trial and error. Why might unhelpful ways of coping develop? We are going to look at 4 specific reasons why those who experienced childhood harm are more likely to develop maladaptive means of coping. But first, we need to make an important point. Most behaviors that today can be considered unhelpful means of coping started out as a way to get safety, regulate painful emotions, or get very human needs met. We will use the term coping in this chapter, but we could also use the term traumatic adaptations, which has a very similar meaning. If you experienced abuse, neglect, or abandonment, you had to adapt to or cope with these frightening and lonely experiences. You will have done whatever was seen as necessary at the time. Some turn to obsessive compulsive behaviors. Others develop eating disordered behaviors. Others learn to avoid people or places. Some fight, lie, or steal. Some develop phobias. Others begin picking at their skin or pulling hair out, and so on. No child or adolescent has a moment where they think, I'll develop some really unhealthy coping behaviors to become a problem to myself and annoy others. You develop unhelpful coping because you were trying to get safety, manage emotional pain, or get understandable needs met. You were just trying to adapt to traumatic experiences. So, unhelpful coping can also be seen as a traumatic adaptation, suggesting that you look at unhelpful coping psychologically and with self compassion rather than through the lens of self blame is not about being nice, it's literally a more valid way of seeking understanding. So, let's look at 4 specific reasons why those who experience childhood harm may develop unhelpful ways of coping. First, as children, many were not soothed or cared for when they were in emotional or physical pain. Imagine a 4-year-old girl. She is running, trips over, and skins her knee on rough tarmac. Blood comes oozing out of the wound, and she begins to sob in pain and shock. Her father runs over, picks her up, and brings her into the house, reassuring her that he will sort it out. He then carefully stops the bleeding and cleans and bandages the wound, all the time soothing his daughter with his words. She becomes calm, and the pain and shock go away. Soothing the emotional and physical pain that children experience is what many parents do, and it's essential for children to experience this support many times as they are developing. However, something else is happening to this 4-year-old girl. She is learning that pain can get soothed, and that this often happens through caring relationships. She is learning that she can trust others to help soothe her pain. And if her physical or emotional pain gets soothed by caring adults consistently, she learns from these experiences and is therefore more able to soothe and care for herself. Being cared for and soothed allows her to develop an internal model of self care and self soothing. Those who experienced childhood abuse and neglect were often at a big disadvantage. Their emotional and physical pain was often not soothed and may have been caused by the very people who should have been helping them with pain. As adults, they may have little understanding of how to soothe their own pain in healthy ways. The result is that, as adults, they may cope with emotional pain in rather isolated, extreme, and ultimately less healthy ways. Second, many had parents or carers who themselves did not cope well with pain. Especially for children, we learn about how to manage or cope by watching others. This is a powerful form of learning called modeling. A child learns how to cope by watching important adults in their lives and how they cope. If those adults are coping and trying to get their needs met through substance abuse, aggression, withdrawal, etc., this is the template a child has for knowing how to cope within their own lives. Third, extreme pain may seem to require more extreme coping. People who experience childhood harm tend to experience more extreme psychological pain in response to life events. If an adult who was well cared for as a child gets some really disappointing news or experiences a rejection, they may feel upset, drink a couple of extra beers that evening, or vent to a friend. If someone who experienced childhood abuse or neglect has a similar experience, they may feel utterly distraught or abandoned, and they may experience a need to cope in more extreme ways, e.g., heavy intoxication, isolation, self-harming, etc. Fourth, some people who experience childhood harm don't trust others to help them with their emotional pain, and so lack an important means of coping. This is an understandable reaction. Someone who didn't get helped with pain and confusion as a child can have a harder time trusting others as an adult. So rather than seeking support from others when they are in pain, they may feel they need to cope in an isolated way. If you have a history of being harmed by people, the idea of getting pain soothed through intimate relationships can evoke anxiety. The problem is that there are times when everyone needs someone else to help them through something painful. If you can identify with any of the above explanations, this may not only enhance insight, but it may help you feel more compassionate with yourself in relation to coping problems you have experienced previously. Exercise 1. Why might you be vulnerable to coping in less helpful ways? Please pause the audio and complete Exercise 1 in the guidebook. Blocking and numbing strategies. Every infant, child, and adolescent will have many experiences of being scared, angry, sad, lonely, confused, or in physical pain. They should feel safe enough to cry or to ask for help. An adult should be attuned to their emotions and needs and should respond to soothe distress or bring understanding. If this does not happen, the child or adolescent will have to find ways of soothing or numbing distress on their own. The problem is that they are not developmentally equipped to do this. Below our coping strategies, people who experience childhood harm often rely on to block, avoid, or numb painful feelings. Such strategies may have developed at any point, childhood, adolescence, or young adulthood. They often become a pattern of coping. See what you can identify with, either in the past or present. As mentioned, you may feel badly about how you have coped, or you might worry that if you acknowledge how you cope, someone may try to stop you. And there is almost certainly a part of you that doesn't want to stop because you rely on how you cope to get rid of painful feelings. So, here is some reassurance. The reading and exercises below are for you. This chapter will not try to convince you to be different. We all need our defenses and our coping strategies. This chapter is simply an opportunity to reflect on coping and whether you may wish to make some changes. Drugs and alcohol. Traumatic experiences usually lead to painful psychological experiences such as PTSD, chronic anxiety, or depression. It should not surprise us that many who have experienced historical trauma will rely on coping through substance misuse or addiction. Between 30 to 50% of people who experience significant historical trauma will develop substance abuse problems. All coping strategies represent an attempt to control emotional states. And of course, drugs and alcohol will do the job, although often with negative consequences to health, relationships, and self esteem. Drugs such as alcohol, heroin, barbiturates, or ketamine have the effect of depressing or calming states of distress. Drugs such as cocaine, methamphetamine, or amphetamine can act as stimulants, allowing access to deadened emotions and physical sensations. Some drugs, like cannabis, don't fit neatly into one category. So called legal highs represent a broad range of substances, are not well understood by many clinicians, or users for that matter, and are a growing concern within mental health and medical systems. Those who experienced childhood harm are more likely to feel overwhelmed by emotions or emotionally numb. So, understandably, they may be vulnerable to drug and alcohol abuse. Some seem to keep drug or alcohol use under some measure of control. For others, either past or present, it can have very destructive effects on self concept, relationships, education, work, or health. Food. A surprising number of women and men who experienced childhood harm can develop an unhealthy relationship with food, developing eating difficulties or even a full blown eating disorder. As explored in the chapter on childhood harm and the body, those who experienced historical trauma are often disconnected from the physical sensations or signals coming from their bodies, or they may simply get signals of distress much of the time. Some don't experience hunger because they are just not in touch with the physical signals of hunger. Some may overeat as a way of trying to manage chronic states of emotional distress. Food can become a way of feeling a sense of control in a world which is otherwise perceived as dangerous. These individuals usually lack the sense of control that should get experienced through a secure self concept, secure attachments, and confidence that they can regulate their emotions. So, they develop a relationship with food which goes way beyond the role food is supposed to play in one's life. Food is no longer just about the pleasure of eating and nutrition, it's about feeling in control. Food restriction, food binging, use of junk food, laxative misuse, overuse of diet sodas, diet pills, or over-exercising can play a role. All of this can be tied to an intense sensitivity about whether we are acceptable to others or a need to stay in control emotionally. For some, food can act like any drug. Obsessive compulsive behaviors. Uncertainty is a core feature of human experience. We may plan our time and order our lives, but there will always be features of experience that are simply outside of our control. For people who experienced a secure attachment and protection from harm in childhood, tolerating the uncertain nature of experience is likely to be easier. They may think if something unplanned or difficult crops up, we'll just have to deal with it and things will probably be okay in the end. However, for some people who experienced childhood trauma, the uncertain nature of existence is very hard to tolerate. For them, the nature of control takes on a rather black and white quality. If they are not feeling in control, then they are out of control. If they do not have lots of reassurance, then something bad or terrible is likely to happen to them or those they love. This is an understandable reaction to experiences of childhood abuse or neglect. Threat and harm were very real when they were young, and they did not feel the sense of security and control which comes from being cared for and protected. They learned that the world is a dangerous place and that they must cope by doing everything they can to get control and prevent harm. Obsessive compulsive difficulties can be a way of trying to be in control and prevent harm. The obsessive part of this problem just means worrying like mad or imagining everything that might possibly go wrong. By imagining everything bad that might happen, you are trying to control potential danger and therefore achieve reassurance. The compulsive part of this problem means doing something, often repetitively or ritualistically, to gain control over imagined threats. For example, repetitively checking on things like locks or appliances, repetitive hand washing or excessive cleaning, continually checking that loved ones are safe, or arranging things in exactly the right way. As with obsessing, compulsive behaviors are a way of trying to get control and reassurance. The problem is that all the obsessing and compulsive behaviors are never enough to really get reassurance, and the individual can become exhausted by their attempts. And they are missing out on life and relationships in the process. It's a difficult journey, but learning that the danger was in the past and that the world really is safer now is necessary. For those with obsessive compulsive difficulties, learning to tolerate normal levels of uncertainty is part of recovery. Manic behavior, perfectionism, or workaholism. For many, thoughts or feelings associated with the past are always in the background, waiting to pop up and disturb them, either in their conscious thoughts or in their dreams. Some will cope by throwing themselves into projects, activities, or work with an intensity designed to distract them from their past. They may strive for perfection in the process. It's as if they think, if I can run fast enough, the memories can't catch me. This can work as a coping strategy to an extent, but it can also be exhausting, and some will crash out after a while. Pete was a victim of severe physical and sexual childhood abuse, and he's a good example of this type of coping. As he put it, quote, I'm a self-employed brickie, or bricklayer. There's loads of jobs available, so I'd work for about 12 hours a day and 6 or 7 days a week. People on the work sites were amazed at how fast I'd go, and they thought I needed the money, but I didn't. I just needed to keep going. End quote. And then, after one particularly full week of bricklaying, Pete damaged a ligament in his shoulder and had to stop work. Having lost his main means of coping, he was more exposed than ever to painful memories and feelings, and he broke down. Had he not torn that ligament, Pete may not have found his way to therapy. Self-harm. For some who get flooded by powerful feelings, often anger or emptiness, self-harming can seem like the only way to get some relief. For those who don't rely on self-harm, it can seem odd that cutting, burning, hitting yourself, or pulling hair out can provide comfort and soothing. However, for some people who experienced childhood harm, that's how it works. Juliet, an individual who experienced childhood sexual abuse, put it like this, quote, I try not to cut myself because I know I'll feel rubbish about doing it later on. But when I get to a certain point of feeling terrible, it seems like the only way out. When I do self-harm, it's like my emotional pain turns into physical pain, and then I feel calm for a while. I really want to stop, though. End quote. After the relief from a self-harming episode, the individual can feel guilt and regret. We rarely meet someone who relies on self-harm and genuinely wants to self-harm. Many describe self-harming as having an addictive quality they want to be free from. Other addictive or compulsive behaviors. Blocking or numbing strategies are anything we might do which, at least temporarily, calms painful feelings or memories. We've mentioned some of the most common strategies, but the variety of methods is pretty wide. Compulsive spending or shopping, gambling, hoarding, compulsive sexuality, i.e., promiscuity, affairs, or addictive use of pornography, addictive video gaming and internet use, dangerous thrill seeking, etc. It's not necessarily what you do that matters, it's why and how driven you feel to do it. It's whether the behavior is helping you meet important needs or becoming another problem on top of the past trauma. Exercise 2: Blocking and Numbing Strategies. Please pause the audio and complete Exercise 2 in the guidebook. Relationship style as a way of coping. Blocking and numbing strategies are often ways of coping on your own. However, it's also essential that coping is understood relationally, i.e., the pattern of how you cope and get needs met through your relationships. Below is a model adapted from the very helpful work of Jeffrey E. Young and Janet S. Klosko. However, before describing these styles, there are a few important caveats we want to make clear. First, the four relationship coping styles we explore below represent a model for understanding human experience, and models never truly capture an individual human being. As such, people who experienced childhood harm often do not fit neatly into one style of coping. You may recognize yourself coping in a particular style within one context or relationship, but may slip into a different style in another context or relationship. Or perhaps one style was more prominent at one time, but not another during your life. Second, it's important to point out that many people who experienced childhood trauma can at times cope within relationships in healthy, enlivening, and productive ways. They do not always cope through the four styles indicated below. Third, if you do fall into coping in one or more of these styles, there are usually understandable historical reasons why this is the case, as will be pointed out. If you recognize yourself coping through the styles below, please try to see this with self-compassion. Having mentioned these caveats, many people who experienced childhood harm can identify with certain relationship coping styles. As you read, see what looks familiar to you. How it works. The avoidant or isolating style of coping is characterized by withdrawing from people or society. This individual may be socially phobic and so avoids situations or places where there are many people, e.g., shopping centers, public transport. They find excuses in order not to attend social events and may spend much time on their own. They are mistrustful and quick to imagine people will harm, use, or manipulate them. Avoiding people or places seems like the best bet for staying safe and in control. Rarely, however, is any individual completely avoidant or isolating. They may allow some limited relationships with others, just as long as it doesn't get too close or intimate. Ryan is a young man we worked with who had very limited relationships in the real world, but online gaming allowed him a degree of connection to others, though only through anonymous pseudonames. He ran into a crisis when a longer-term fellow gamer, who by coincidence lived locally, wanted to meet up with him for coffee. The idea seemed so threatening, he considered canceling his account with his favorite gaming site, something his therapist managed to talk him out of. While some who struggle with an avoidant or isolating style live alone, some may live with family members or others. However, despite living with others, they may isolate themselves in particular ways. perhaps creating private worlds within the context of family or flatmates. Some with an avoidant or isolating style can show self sufficiency. However, in a relationship, others tend to become excessively dependent on another person or the state for many years. Developing a dependency on one other person or the state allows them to avoid the rest of the world of relationships. These individuals usually have a genuine desire to be independent and self reliant, but the abuse or neglect they experienced damaged their self confidence. Some with an avoidant or isolating style of coping may develop very important relationships with pets. Pets, often, though not always dogs, can provide the individual with affection and a sense of purpose, but manage to do so in a way which is not threatening. Why it developed. These individuals were often harmed by others in childhood and had good reasons not to trust. As a child, they may have coped by trying not to be seen, fading into the woodwork, or keeping their heads down. They may have learned that by avoiding or hiding from those who harmed them, they could reduce or have some control over the trauma. This pattern of being mistrustful, assuming others will harm you, and avoiding people and social situations developed as a means of trying to meet a need for safety. The dilemma. Individuals with an avoidant or isolating style of relationship coping have the same core needs as everybody. Social isolation or avoidance may seem to offer a semblance of safety, but needs for belonging or intimacy go unmet. If unhealthy levels of dependency are also a feature, this undermines the individual's need for self esteem. Depression and underachieving in life are common. The challenge. The challenge is to see that the fear response to social situations is often disproportionate to any actual threats. The challenge is also to learn to develop trust for situations and relationships where it is well placed. For those who are safe, the challenge is often about recognizing that current experiences are not the same as what happened to you when you were a child. And the challenge is to choose to be with people who will not repeat a pattern of hurting you. The rigid or controlling coping style. Some people who experience childhood harm are less socially avoidant. Perhaps they have a partner and children, and they might have relationships outside of the home. But, like the avoidant or isolating style, they experienced threat or neglect in childhood. As such, they don't trust others, and they may imagine life as a dangerous place. Those with a rigid or controlling style believe that if they are not in control, they are out of control. If others show independence, assert themselves, or have other important relationships, this can feel threatening. If they receive criticism, they experience it as humiliating rather than just feedback. To cope, they feel a strong need to be in control of their environment and their relationships. Their attempts to be in control can sometimes feel suffocating to others. If people they are closest to assert themselves, have other friendships, or express independence, they can feel threatened. If they are put under stress, they can even react with outbursts of anger or aggression. They are more likely to cope by what clinicians Lublin and Johnson refer to as dumping. This person was dumped on by people who abused or neglected them in childhood. There is anger and frustration which is built up over the years, feelings which are difficult to find an outlet for. The people who hurt them normally cannot or will not acknowledge what they did or make amends. At times, the frustration is too much. They can regret it later on, but when under stress, they can dump on others too. If this style of relationship coping sounds unattractive, there are two things to keep in mind. First, as long as they feel in control, they may be lively and fun and have a range of attractive attributes that shine through. Second, despite how difficult their behavior can sometimes be for others, their manner of coping needs to be seen with empathy. They don't really want to cope as they do. Underneath the rigid and controlling style of coping is someone who is scared that history will repeat itself and they will get hurt, humiliated, or abandoned all over again. Why it developed. As a child, they were abused or neglected, and they may have felt humiliated. But at a certain point, they began to fight back. They learned that by fighting back and doing whatever they could to be in control, they could get some needs met. They don't ever want to be humiliated again. This means of coping became a pattern which they took into adulthood relationships. The dilemma. These individuals want to feel emotionally safe and have a sense of belonging, just like everybody. However, their controlling behavior can push important people away from them, and they might even get left in some